Hi, my name is Kevin Winter and I'm Assistant Curator at the National Civil War Centre. During the lockdown period, when you can't visit the museum, I thought we might explore what was happening in the Newark area during some key periods in history. I thought we would start at the time we have the earliest evidence of humans in the area during what is known as the Stone Age. This long period is split into three periods, each ending with the suffix lithic, which means related or made from stone. Our first period is the Palaeolithic or Old Stone Age, and is a period from 2.6 million years ago to around 10,000 years ago. During this time, what became the island of Britain was largely covered in ice, which retreated now and again, allowing a humanoid band of hunter-gatherers to make their way here. A few years ago, a storm on the Norfolk coast at Haysborough uncovered footprints that may have been made by a family around 900,000 years ago. This is the early evidence of our human ancestors found so far in Britain. The oldest human fossils have been found at Boxgrove in Sussex and date to around 500,000 years ago. At this time we were still connected to the continent by chalk ridge, remains of which can still be seen at Dover and Calais, until a mega flood around 425,000 years ago created the English Channel. One of our hominoid ancestors, the Neanderthals, appeared to have been in the south of the country around 225,000 years ago, until ice once again covered the land. Britain was unoccupied between 180,000 and 60,000 years ago, when Neanderthals returned. By around 40,000 years ago, they became extinct and modern humans reached Britain. It was not until around 11,700 years ago that the climate became warm enough for them to live and survive. Mammoths would still have wandering around Britain at the end of the last ice age, and we have mammoth tusks and teeth from around the area. They're often found in gravel quarries such as Hoveringham, and there is a mammoth tooth on display in the Newark Gallery. Britain was still joined to the continent until rising sea levels cut the land bridge around 11,000 years ago, leaving us connected only by a large plain known as Doggerland, which existed until it is thought a tsunami caused by melting ice off what is now Norway drowned the last link around 7,500 years ago. This was our first Brexit. Between 1991 and 2018, Farndon Archaeological Research Institute investigated a site between Farndon and Newark, close to the new route of the A46. Around 14,000 years ago, as warming was already underway and river gravel in the Trent Valley that had accumulated during cold phases began to be washed away, the river acquired a braided or wandering mode with elevated gravel islands amongst multiple shallow river channels. The movements of Paleolithic hunter-gatherers would have been dictated by the behaviour of their animal food sources, which was a function of their migration and breeding cycles. The hunter-gatherers would have led an itinerant life, moving in a predictable seasonal cycle along specific corridors like ridges or river valleys. They relied on animals to provide meat and marrow for food, hide and sinews for clothing, and bone and antlers for tools. The hunter-gatherers would have known and used certain natural stopping points, and from time to time along the way they would have lost or discarded objects. It's the objects that have been left behind that provide the only evidence we have so far of their presence. The tools can be identified as belonging to more than one particular style, which suggests that they've been created over many years, possibly two distinct periods, implying that this journeying along river valleys and trackways was a way of life for these hunter-gatherers for a considerable period. Standing on a vantage point on a rise near Halton, our Ice Age hunters would have looked out over an open, undulating plain with a wide expanse of shallow braided rivers now known as the Trent and Devon. Investigations by the Ice Age Journeys team have so far enabled us to envisage several possible scenarios at Farndon. One scene might place a group on a slight rise above a flat riverbed, possibly a vantage and crossing point. Here some individuals might be on lookout duty, whilst others, maybe with an animal carcass, needing to cut up flesh and clean the hide, produced or napped their flint tools on the spot, as they made their temporary camp beside the river. Another possibility would have our people closer to the river, maybe using the shallow water for their own washing or washing animal hides, which is scraped with freshly prepared flint tools. The hides, perhaps pierced to lash them together, might be used for making garments and possibly also as shelters, essential for protection against the cold. Other flint tools might have been used for whittling wood or scoring bone to remove sharp splinters for piercing. The flint came from the Lincolnshire Wolds or Norfolk and would have been picked up and carried with them after first crossing Doggerland. These images are taken from the Ice Age Journeys website and show how the flint flakes might have been used. and also the boring tools that might have been used for making holes in either tools or in the cloth so that they could then be sewn together. It is likely that Farnham was linked to Creswell Crags, where evidence for hunter-gatherers from this period have been found in the caves, including distinctive flint points known as Creswellian, which are also found at Farnham. One part of the band may have made a camp here, whilst the hunters followed their prey up to the area around Creswell Crags. After they captured and slaughtered their prey, they would have returned to the rest of the band at Farnham before going back across the land bridge to the continent before autumn set in. There are also links to a site at Bradgate Park in Leicestershire where similar flints have been found. The second period is the Mesolithic or Middle Stone Age, from around 11,000 to 5,000 years ago. A further ice age meant Britain was abandoned between 11,400 and 11,200 years ago. By around 11,000 years ago, Mesolithic people occupied Britain, and the land has been occupied ever since. Warmer temperatures meant that pine, birch and alder forests thrived across the land, making it less favourable for reindeer and wild horse that had sustained the early hunter-gatherers. Elk, red deer, roe deer, wild boar, pigs and aurochs, large wild cattle, required different hunting techniques. Stone tools were adapted with barbs to make sure they stayed in the flesh of the hunted animals. Small flints, known today as microliths, were developed to be hafted onto wooden harpoons or spears. Woodworking tools were developed to deal with the abundant forests. Dogs became domesticated due to the help they could provide when hunting. Humans spread and reached the far north of Scotland during this period. Sites from the British Mesolithic include Starcar in Yorkshire, where the remains of wooden buildings and platforms along a former lake shore have been found, indicating that people were starting to settle at least for set periods during the year. Strange red deer antler frontlets have been found on the site, which may have been used as headdresses for rituals by shamans or used by hunters hunting the red deer. Britain's oldest complete human remains date from around 10,000 years ago and were found in a cave near Cheddar in Somerset. Using reconstruction techniques, scientists have reconstructed how he might have looked, with dark skin, blue or green eyes and dark brown hair. There are very few human remains from the Mesolithic, but in 1997 excavations for the new Stathorpe power station unearthed the femur or hip bone. This appears to have come from another watery site, probably alongside the River Trent, as at Starcar. This drew interest from Dr. Tom Booth and other experts in the Natural History Museum who were investigating ancient human genetics, partly to try to understand when humans became tolerant to lactose, in other words, when they started drinking milk and eating dairy products. Unfortunately, when tested, the bone produced no DNA, and it is currently not on display. Our final period is the Neolithic or New Stone Age, from around 4,200 to 2,750 years ago. This is the period when plants and animals were domesticated. There is some argument on why the new ways of life took around 1,000 years longer to reach Britain from the continent, after the ideas and practices had spread from the fertile corridor of the Middle East. It introduced a more settled way of life and ultimately led to societies becoming divided into groups of farmers, artisans, and the emergence of leaders. Forest clearances were undertaken to provide room for cereal cultivation and animal herds. Native cattle and pigs were reared, while sheep and goats were later introduced from the continent, as were the wheats and barleys grown in Britain. The earliest earthwork sites in Britain began to appear during the early Neolithic in the form of long barrows used for communal burial. Stone-built houses on Orkney, such as those at Skara Brae, are evidence of settlements in Britain. Leaf-shaped arrowheads, round-based pottery types, and the beginnings of polished axe production are common indicators of this period. The Middle Neolithic, 3,300 BC to 2,900 BC, saw the development of cursus monuments, as well as the building of impressive chamber tombs. The earliest stone circles and individual burials also appeared. Different pottery types, such as grooveware, appeared during the later Neolithic, around 2,900 BC to 2,200. In addition, new enclosures called henges were built, along with stone rows and the famous sites of Stonehenge, Avebury, and Silbury Hill in Wiltshire. There is evidence of long-distance trade. Wooden tools and bowls were common, and bows were also constructed. One example of long-distance trade are jadeite axes. Jadeite axes were brought to the UK around 4,000 years BC. The jadeite axe in our collection was made in the Italian Alps, far from Coddington where it was found. The axes were polished and would have taken many hours to make one. They were probably used as ritual or ceremonial objects. Researchers have argued that the axes were status symbols, a luxurious confirmation of the power and prestige of the owner. The one in our collection is very good to handle and shows no sign of use, indicating that it wasn't used, so adding to the impression that they were ceremonial or a status symbol. Jade is not found in Britain. The rock comes from Mount Viso, located southwest of Turin, and Mount Bigua above Genoa in Italy. The axe heads were made near high mountains. People who made these axe heads climbed to heights of over 2,000 metres in the Italian Alps. There are many other amazing objects from these periods in our collection, and eventually the whole of the Fine and Flints archive will be coming to us. Next time, we'll look at the introduction of metals to Britain and what effect the Bronze and Iron Ages had around Newark.